everyone. My name is Ann Moser, and I am Education Coordinator and Librarian for Wisconsin Sea Grant. We're a program based here in Wisconsin, so I'm your facilitator for our two wonderful authors. I really want to welcome you to our event today when we're going to kind of take a peek under the water and explore this world of fish. And so before I start, I have to do my required housekeeping. First, we do want to honor our sponsors. We can do this event, and it's free of charge for everyone. So please if you see anyone from Madison Public Library around, to say thank you to them. They've been doing all this incredible work for 150 years for our community, so it's pretty wonderful. We're very blessed here in Madison. That was my next reminder. Thank you for that perfect just glue in. And also we want to thank the Madison Public Library Foundation because they do a lot to support this event. And I do also want to acknowledge the Wisconsin Science Festival. We have partnered with them on some activities with the book festival. So it's been really fun to bring art and the humanities together with science during these times, especially when we're trying to communicate all these wonderful stories. So thank you to the festival. So before we begin, let us honor everyone here in the room and especially our speakers by making sure your phones are all silenced and quiet. And I'm going to just double check mine. Yes. So finally, if you share anything on social media, I'm asked to tell you to use the hashtag WIBookFest in your postings. And if you put any photos up or whatever, just getting that energy going. So we have two authors today that are going to explore the world of fish, one in the marine environment and one in the freshwater environment. So we're going to start off with Joe Meisel. Joe is a biologist, a conservationist, and an educator. He is co-founder of the SEBA Foundation for Tropical Conservation and has led research, education, and habitat protection programs for nearly 30 years. His books, which he's going to talk about today, we have Marlin's Fiery Eye, and also we have The Orchids of Tropical America, an Introduction and Guide. They both are inspired by his love of teaching, and they embrace the twin beliefs that people will protect that which they love, and that there are endless reasons to fall in love with nature. And I have to agree with him wholeheartedly on that. We're also going to hear from Rebecca Wojahn. Rebecca is the author of our Saving Our Sturgeon. So when we move a little bit closer to home and we look at a freshwater species, she is also the author of many middle grade novels, nonfiction picture books, regional biographies, and an educational series. And despite all of these genres and age levels, her books all celebrate the natural world with a dose of mystery and a pinch of humor. And I can tell you that this book that she's going to talk about does that. It has some really fun little tidbits to raise not only kids, but also adults. I find it to be a very humorous read, which kind of surprised me because we're talking science here. And Becky's been honored by many different state and regional awards. And when she's not writing, she is a school librarian for a high school in the Eau Claire region. So we're going to start with you, Joe. Take it away.
Thanks very much, Ann and Becky. It's great to share a stage with everybody. As Ann said, I'm sort of a professor by training, so I can't speak while I'm sitting down. So I'm just going to get up and do some stuff over here. So yeah, it's really great to be here. I've lived in Wisconsin for a really long time. My friends never stop reminding me that I grew up in Chicago, but I've lived in Wisconsin for more than anywhere else. Becky wrote a really fabulous book about sturgeon that she'll talk about, so that she's kind of covering a lot of the freshwater fishes that are more familiar within the state of Wisconsin. The book that I wrote is about saltwater fish, fishes of the ocean, and There's 35,000 species of fish in the world. About half of them are in the ocean, so 18,000 species of fish. It's a lot to cover. But I've been teaching marine biology, even though that's not my original training. I was originally a terrestrial biologist. But I've been teaching about marine biology for a long time with students from UW and elsewhere. And every time I would dig around and look into stories about fish, I would always find things that just blew my mind, you know? Things that I think most people don't know. A lot of people are fishermen or fisherwomen, fishers is one of the terms, and scuba divers or snorkelers. But those folks only get access to a pretty tiny fraction of the ocean. Just the surface if you're scuba diving or snorkeling, mostly near shore if you're a fisher. And so most of the ocean is completely invisible to all of us. And you know, while people know that, oh, if you ask somebody about a giraffe, like, well, they have a long neck because they reach up to branches up high and feed from them. Or a toucan has a long bill because it reaches out to get berries. But you start asking people about what's the little funny things underneath the sturgeon, and everybody's like, I don't know, what is that thing looking there? So I kept finding all these amazing stories about fishes, and the more that I dug into it, the more I thought, man, people should know about this. This is just terrific. And I really believe that the more people learn to love nature and things that are in nature, the more you learn to protect it. This book is written for lay people, just your average audience. You could read it to your kids at night if you want. They might have to look up a couple of words, but it's not super dense. And I'm not really trying to give a very stern conservation message in it either. I'm just really, really interested in beautiful things about fish. So when I thought about today, and it's kind of gray, and we're sort of getting into the dark period of time out here, I thought, well, what's some cool stuff that people in Wisconsin definitely, none of us get to see at all? And the book, I should say, is structured around different groups of fishes. So there's the marlin is part of a chapter about all the big predators, so like tuna and marlin and sailfish. There's a chapter on sharks. There's a couple of chapters on coral reefs, because those are super interesting and really diverse. But there's also a chapter on the deep sea. And when you get into this cold, unlit, you know, dark, almost empty region of the world, it's a place that none of us visit and nobody ever knew anything about until we started having submersible submarines and a few other things. So I just want to play a little video, I think I will, about that just shows some examples of the fishes from the deep sea, and we'll jump in from there. So it's just something to remind you of places that we never get to visit. So just go over the edge and then go down 10,000 feet or 30. This is a barrel eye. It's been fairly recently discovered. Those two green blobs are its eyes. This is an anglerfish. I'll talk to you guys about those. That's Finding Nemo, you know, kind of made those popular. They're the ones with the little light that lures in fish in the deep. So that's the light illuminated at night. That's actually bioluminescent little communal critters that live in there. This is a rat tail, so it's very, very dark under the deep ocean. So fish that do see have enormous eyes. There's also very, very little food, so everything has to try to save energy. And that motion of swimming like an eel is the most efficient way that an animal can swim. So that's back to the barrel eye. Those are its eyes, those green blobs, and they're inside the head of the organism. There's no external pupils at all, and they're just looking straight up through a transparent top of the head. I'll come back to that in a sec. These are some of the hot water vents. It was discovered in the 70s, where there's hot boiling water that comes out. It's another one of these incredibly odd fishes that are found down there. So most of this is video that's taken from remote submersibles, small little submarines that go down with remote control, usually by wire, and take video, sometimes with lights. Sometimes they use baits to try to draw stuff in because things are not very abundant there. A lot of stuff is bioluminescent. That's a viperfish that's using little dots to sort of attract things to come to it, and then it has this gigantic opening mouth. You would not want to run into that on a dark night. Some of these fish are the darkest animals on planet Earth. Some of these fish will shine lights to look for prey, and the prey are so black because of the amount of melanin that they pack onto their skin so that they can't be seen by the flashlight, that they're literally the blackest animals on planet Earth. These are some of the hot water vents that have been discovered, a whole new world down there that doesn't rely on sunlight at all. This is a tripod fish. It uses its little fins underneath it to sit on the fins waiting for food, and it just takes off going for it. This is back to this barrel eye again. So these two little dots in the front are actually the nostrils, but the eyes are inside the fish looking up because it swims around looking up with the very faintest of light from above, trying to find prey. So it just rotates its eyes up. When it gets close to something, then it can rotate the eyes forward and go to attack them. So just some kind of snippets of stuff. The book itself is, like I said, divided up into chapters about the different areas. The illustrations in this book are provided actually by Mariah Robinson. She's a local artist from here at Madison, did her degree at UW. So a very beautiful 36, I think, black and white Indian ink drawings like this. So back to this barrel eye, they eat siphonophores, which are these big, long jellyfish. And they swim around and they're looking up against the light just to see the slightest little shadow or silhouette. And they turn the eyes up inside of that barrel. Those are pretty wild. I'm going to jump ahead one. This is another one that it's called a spiny skate. And there's all these crazy pressures in the deep sea, right? It's dark, so that's one of the problems. It's really, really cold. It gets to right about freezing and stays that way. And so if you are a skate and you're laying your eggs into a little egg case like this, which sometimes wash up on shores, you can sometimes find them from different kinds of skates, then you have this problem that the egg case is just sitting out there where anything can eat it until it hatches. And if it's cold, it takes longer to hatch, right? So these spiny skates were discovered near the pillar with the black smoke that was pouring out. Those are hot water vents. So there's hot water coming out of there. If you were to stick your hand in it, it's boiling hot. It's actually hotter than boiling because of the pressure. And it would just melt your hand off. But they figured out how to lay those eggs just close enough to the vent that it doesn't poach, but it's just warm enough that it accelerates the development, so those things hatch about 10 days earlier than if you laid them somewhere else, and therefore they get the babies out before they can get predated. So this is another just crazy creature that uses these deep sea areas. Let's see if I can go back. Oh, sweet. So this is the anglerfish, devil anglerfish, and I wanted to read a little piece from the book about these anglerfish. These, again, were discovered. They were originally caught in some nets, and eventually some deep sea submarines that were manned or peopled saw them, and then eventually they started using remote submersibles to really kind of figure them out. But every now and then they would catch one with some little weird kind of a thing hanging onto it, parasite-looking thing. They weren't really sure what they were. Sometimes they found as many as 8 of them. And all of this happens because these fish live in this dark area. It's cold, and it's really pretty empty. There's not a lot of food down there. It's not like the plains of Africa where there's grass and there's just animals everywhere. It's real empty, and so it's extremely difficult to find food, so hence the light. You're just kind of waving that light around like, hey, come over here, and then stuff comes by like, what's that light? And it's really, really hard to find mates, right? It's not like a singles bar, it's like a singles bar where you're the only person there and you're the only person for like 1,000 miles, so you're trying to figure out how to deal with this. So let's see. Instead of searching the sea, females release a powerfully appealing pheromone to draw mates to them. Males home in on the scent using their oversized nostrils, reputed to be the largest of any vertebrate, then follow the light of the dangling esca, that's what that thing is called, until they latch onto a partner. Literally. Males are a mere fraction of the size of an adult female, and when first discovered, they were thought to be tiny external parasites, which, in truth, they are. Many anglerfish males have non-functional mouthparts and will die if they do not find a mate. Once they join in watery matrimony, the male attaches to the female's body, dissolves her skin with a salivary enzyme, and connects his circulatory system to hers. Like a leech, he draws nutrients directly from her and will never live a solo existence again. Anglerfish with parasitic males, about half the known species, have immune systems peculiarly adapted to this curious behavior. Unlike people, in whom organ grafts are often rejected with disastrous consequences, these anglers lack those histocompatibility pathways that flag foreign tissues for destruction. They literally cannot distinguish between their flesh and that of their mates. Meanwhile, the male's gonads are stimulated during fusion with the female, and soon he is able to release sperm into the water to fertilize her eggs. In a few species, the female decorates herself with as many as 8 males each contributing to reproduction, albeit to no other chores of domesticity like swimming or foraging. One wonders if not a few human females might assess the role of their males as being similarly limited in supportive scope. So those are anglerfish. There's a ton of fun stories about this deep water stuff, mostly because it's just a place that is pretty much unseen by all of us, and where the pressures of life are really, really different. They're really, really extreme. And how are we doing on time? All right, great. So, like I said, the book is broken up into big chapters. There's one about sharks. There's one about whale sharks. There's one about small schooling fish like sardines and anchovies, which are all interesting. And it tries to go into what is it about the environment that these organisms live in that makes them special? How do they adapt to it? And what makes them kind of similar? So I try to cluster them all together. It's not an identification book, but it should be just a fun read. I try to throw in some humor. My friend Rit said it sounds like Groucho Marx is hiding behind every line, like with the little cigar or whatever, which I like Groucho Marx a lot, so I'm kind of happy about that. And as I said, I don't generally have like a real strong conservation focus in it. I'm just trying to get people to learn more about fish and then kind of pay attention to them. But you can't really write a book about fish, which produce ocean fish, which produce something like 100 million tons of food every year for humans, without talking about people. So there's a bunch of stuff in here about how the book relates to people, how fishes relate to people. And I wanted to just end on a little note of this is a friend of mine on the right. That's Captain Megan Karatza. She owns the Centurion. That's a fishing boat up in Alaska, in Homer, Alaska. And she's a salmon fisher. And I think that the idea of eating wild fish is interesting and a challenging one for a lot of people. Many folks choose to be vegetarians for a variety of reasons. That's certainly an awesome choice to make. Thanks to each and every one of you for helping to save the planet one plate at a time. It really makes a big difference. But I will say that the ocean has been producing something like 100 million tons, which is a lot of fish, right? 100 million tons of food every year. Do we have problems in the ocean? Yes. Are there fisheries that are overfishing? Yes. Are there fishes that are going extinct because of fishing? Yes. But there are many, many fishers like Megan and thousands of others around the world who make a really noble living off of this endeavor. They put themselves at risk. They put their families at risk, all to feed not just us, but more than 1 billion people around the world. And so I thought it was interesting to look at some of the work that people like this do. And I'll just end by saying that, so I've got some really nice quotes from her. I don't want to take more time than I'm allowed here. So I'll just say that a brief kind of little fact map. This is the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, produced this report in 2025 that's the state of the world fisheries. This map is really complicated, but I wanted to point out two things. One is that of all of the fisheries in the world taken together, 2/3 of all of the world's fisheries are sustainably fished. So I think a lot of people don't understand that. I think a lot of people think, well, we're fishing the oceans empty, I should never eat fish again. And I would encourage you to reconsider that and to think that, first of all, it provides really good jobs for people like Megan who really care about the ocean. She doesn't want to overfish salmon. She wants it to be there for herself and her kids and her business and the people that she feeds. So 2/3 of all of the fish in the ocean are sustainably fished. They vary in different places. So here off the coast of Ecuador where I work, it's less than half. But if you look in that upper left where it says 92.7, that's more than 90% of all the fish that are fished in that area. So that's like Pacific halibut, haddock, pollock, cod from up there are sustainably fished. So I just wanted to show this to remind people that there's actually a lot of fisheries that are doing really well. The solutions, I think we actually know pretty well how to move from being unsustainable to sustainable. I think Rebecca and I both share an interest in talking about our fishes from a perspective of like optimism and a perspective that we actually know most of the solutions for fishing sustainably, for protecting coral reefs, for protecting sturgeon. And I just encourage everybody to learn to love fish, whether they're salt or freshwater, learn a little bit more about them, and to get educated on some of the solutions that are out there that's really within our reach. It's just a question of getting people to join in. So I hope you enjoyed the talks today. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll turn it over to my partner, Becky.
All right, can you hear me? I didn't want to have that on while he was talking in case I don't know. Thanks, Joe, that was awesome. About 10 years ago, I wrote a picture book called Glow, Animals with Their Own Nightlights, and it's about bioluminescence, and in particular in the ocean, so it was like meeting some old friends again. Fun fact, the anglerfish in our picture book, we actually cropped out the males in the picture because we didn't really want to go there in explaining what was going on with them. So we kept it a little bit more simple for the kids. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit. So we've been talking about saltwater fish globally. We're going to zoom into freshwater fish, and in particular freshwater fish in Wisconsin, and in particular the lake sturgeon. So that's what my book is about, Saving Our Sturgeon, Protecting Wisconsin's Ancient Fish. And I just want to tell you a little bit about their story of their history in Wisconsin, but also very much their history with the people of Wisconsin and how they have interacted throughout the years. So to start, if you aren't familiar with lake sturgeon, they are a very unique fish. They've been on our planet for about 150 million years. So that's like the time of the dinosaurs. They've not evolved a lot since then. So most fish evolved to have scales, to have teeth, to have spinal, spines. Not sturgeon. They have these bony plates that are called scutes on the outside, so they're kind of like an armored fish. They don't have any teeth. So in fact, their mouth is on the bottom of their body, and it sticks out as like a tube when they're bottom feeders. So they go along the bottom of the lake and just kind of suck stuff up. And they have cartilage instead of bones, and a notochord for their nerves down the center of their spine. So they're really unique. They grow to huge sizes, so 6-7 feet long, and they can live for over 100 years. So very unique species. They're native to Wisconsin. And really, there's just these gentle giants that swim around the bottoms of our lakes and slurp up crayfish and snails and anything else that might come up through their mouth. So it's just a little glimpse at them. So historically, lake sturgeon lived in all the waterways of Wisconsin, all the major waterways, the lakes and the rivers, all these different places they could be found. And the indigenous people of Wisconsin depended on the sturgeon for nutrition. They depended on them spiritually. They depended on them culturally. Like they were really ingrained in all the cultures of our native people of Wisconsin. And for thousands of years, they lived together sustainably. And even when you get to the 1800s, when European settlers started coming in, there's still a lot of records of people saying, like, there were so many sturgeon swimming up the river that if you sat on the bridge, you would get splashed by people, and the horses were scared and they ran away. It was estimated there was 11 million sturgeon just in the Great Lakes alone during that time. However, by the end of the 1800s, by the beginning of the 1900s, they were almost extinct. So it had a really very dramatic decline. And there's really 3 different reasons. Well, not 3, but there's many different reasons, but there's kind of 3 that I can group together for you. One is just kind of a general disregard for the fish. This is a little bit hard to see on here, but what we've got here is a bridge and some people hanging over the bridge with fishing line. And the sturgeon are spawning in this river and people are just snagging them. They're not even fishing for them, they're just snagging the fish and pulling them out of there. And people did that for a couple different reasons. Some people did it to eat and to use the food for meat, but other people just really didn't like the fish. They thought of them as a nuisance fish, like carp, and just get them out of there so that we can grow trout and muskie and, the more desirable fish. So that was one of it, is just a general overharvesting and a general disregard for the sturgeon population. The other thing that happened in the late 1800s was obviously as people moved in, industry moved in, people started damming up the rivers. And to create sawmills, lumber mills, later to power electrical plants, that kind of thing. And what happened is when you dam up a river, sturgeon, it turns out, they like to swim around in the bottom of the lakes, But then when they're ready to lay their eggs, they like to swim upriver, and they actually return to the same river that they were born in. And they need several miles of river because they like to lay their eggs way upriver so that those little hatchlings can drift down the river and be safe and grown big enough before they hit the big open water of the lake. So obviously, if you dam up the river, you are limiting that happening for those fish. So dams didn't actively kill the sturgeon, but it certainly prevented future generations from happening. And that happened all over Wisconsin. And it's not just sturgeon that are impacted by dams, but was a big contribution to that decline. And then the third thing was caviar. So caviar has been a delicacy for a long time, but in the late 1800s, refrigeration was invented. And with refrigeration, they were able to ship caviar to places like California and New York and Florida. And suddenly it became a huge boom. And these businesses popped up all around the Great Lakes where they would literally harvest millions and millions of sturgeon a year. And they did it very unsustainably. This is a butchering float. That was literally the caption from this historical photo, in which they would just pull the sturgeon out of the lake, cut them open for the eggs, and then throw the rest of the body away. And obviously this had a huge decline in the population. So much so that between these three different things happening, that even the people who were doing the caviar harvesting noticed that their numbers and their yields were going down year after year. And so by that turn of the century, the 1900s, people who cared about the fish and even people who were making money off the fish were really worried about the fish. So there was a couple things that they talked about doing. The first one was they talked about raising new fish. So let's grow eggs in a hatchery and then put them out in the lakes, and that'll solve the problem, right? We'll have more new sturgeon and we'll be all good. Well, when they started researching that, they found out that no one had ever been successful at raising sturgeon from eggs. They always died, usually of a fungus. So that was really discouraging. That didn't seem like that was going to be a promising solution. So the next thing they did is they started talking about legislation, like laws, rules, like how can we do this? We gotta, these fish are dying off. And there were a lot of species that were kind of dying off. Passenger pigeons kind of happened at that same time and period in our Wisconsin history. And they didn't want that to happen to the sturgeon. So in 1915, they passed a moratorium on any sturgeon harvesting. So no more spearing, no more fishing, no more netting, anything could happen, which got some people upset. So one of the things that happened is that we had different groups of, I remember I showed you the map of Wisconsin before and all those lakes and rivers. So most of those, the sturgeon population was declining. But in the Lake Winnebago area here, the sturgeon population was actually doing okay. And what happened there was that when they dammed up all the rivers around there, it kind of trapped that population into like a closed circuit. And they had enough acreage and enough mileage of water that they were able to sustain themselves. And so the people who lived around Lake Winnebago in that Fox Valley area, they had a long tradition of going out in winter and spearing fish through the ice. And it's still something that happens today. Like if you go up there in February, that's a really big deal. And they didn't like it that they couldn't do that anymore because they had sturgeon. Like, why did this rule have to apply to their sturgeon? And really, it's an interesting question because it's something that kind of runs through the whole book. Because, who do the fish really belong to? Like, can you make a global rule or do people have local control? I am a teacher too, so we have that with education too. Like, do we do, the big group or do you have to look locally? And so they made kind of a stink about it. And here's a couple pictures of just those people. This is 1898 with the ice shanty, and then almost 100 years later, people with the same sturgeon spearing tradition. So they went back and forth. And at the time, there wasn't a DNR, it was the Conservation Commission, which is kind of the precursor to the DNR. And they argued back and forth with politicians and like conservation and different conservation groups in Wisconsin. And finally, people like these were asking like, well, how many sturgeon are there anyway? And what is a good harvest? And how many have we harvested? And the people in the Conservation Commission really didn't have a good answer for that. They realized they didn't have the data. And so what they ended up doing was this group of spearers and the Conservation Commission and the conservationists kind of came together and said, you know what, we need like a fish census. We need to get some numbers and some data here. And that's what they did. So for the first time in the 1930s and 40s, they started tagging sturgeons. They would net them in the spring. They would add tags to their fins so that they could, if they recaptured that sturgeon, they'd be able to see like how much bigger did it get, where did it go, you know, like that kind of stuff. So that was one part of it, and the other part of it is they worked hand in hand with the people who were fishing and spearing the sturgeon, because those people, they did eventually open up regulations on spearing harvesting. So by 1931, it was back open again in different parts of the state. But they did have to have a license to be able to spear or fish for sturgeon. And so what they did is they attached a postcard to that license and said, if you catch one of these fish, please send us your postcard, which has like the length and the weight of what you caught and where it was. And that helped them to gather some data too. And slowly they could kind of start piecing together information. One of the things they also asked for with this little postcard was the sturgeon's head, which was not something that people wanted to mail in. And it's not for the reason that you think. Like when I first read this fact, you know, and I work with kids, so I'm always looking for like the gross facts. It's like, that is disgusting. Who's gonna mail a sturgeon head in the mail? It's not for that reason. It's because there's the tradition of sturgeon head soup, and they wanted the sturgeon head for themselves. So the first years that they did this, they didn't actually get very many sturgeon heads in the mail, you know, go figure. But when they realized the reason, the cultural reason for that, they then changed it and they said, well, how about send us the sturgeon's fins? And the reason why they wanted the sturgeon's head and the sturgeon's fins is because there's a bone in the inner ear of the sturgeon that they can use to date kind of, or to age the fish and figure out how old it is. They can do that with the fin too. It's not quite as accurate. However, once they started sending fins in, they said, if you send us the fins, we will then get back to you and let you know how old your sturgeon was. And so it was the first time where there was really some back and forth of people working together. Like they were fishing, they got to do their fishing and their spearing, but it was also helping with the science part of getting more information about the sturgeon. So that was kind of the first time that they came together. The second time that they came together was a little bit later in the 1960s. So in the 30s and the 40s, they started gathering all this data. And then by the 50s and the 60s, they kind of took the foot off the gas a little bit. They thought, you know, we know about sturgeon. We've learned from gathering this information that sturgeon live over 100 years. We've learned things like sturgeon don't spawn female sturgeon until they're 20 years old. So they stopped tagging sturgeon by the 60s, and the registration forms, the taverns started collecting those instead of the DNR. And so the data got a little bit fuzzy. And that was also about the same time where the water got a little bit fuzzy too, because there was a lot of pollution happening. So there were a few years there that, well, in 1953, just to compare, there were 2,828 sturgeon speared that were recorded. In 1969, there were 8. So it was kind of right back to where we started again. And there was probably more sturgeon than what was indicated because water quality was so bad, they just couldn't see them to spear them. So again, the fishers and the spearers up around that Lake Winnebago really led the charge. They were like, we're concerned about this. The fish aren't there for us to spear anymore. So what's going on? It's time for us to start thinking about raising sturgeon and stocking the lakes again. And the DNR was like, oh, we don't want to do that. First of all, never has happened successfully. So still in the 1970s, late 1970s, it still had never successfully happened in the world. And then secondly, they're like, if we do that, it might indicate to the national government that something's wrong with our sturgeon. And then we might get into like Endangered Species Act and all of that. I don't know that we want to do that. So they went back and forth a lot. But eventually, Bill Casper, who was the one who kind of spearheaded all of this, he said, what if instead of stocking the lakes with these sturgeon that we're going to raise, what if we use them to study them again? And so again, we were right back to that beginning of like, let's gather data, let's see if we can figure out, use that data to learn more about the fish to help save them. So he reached out, and they said, well, we still don't know how to do it. He reached out to a scientist who was at Dartmouth who had been studying sturgeon in Russia, and that he had had an article in National Geographic about it. So Bill Casper reached out to this professor who, when he called him up, the professor was like, what? There's sturgeon in Wisconsin? Why am I going all the way to Russia? Like, it's right here. So, and he said, I do know how to do this. They've been successful in Russia with their sturgeon, which is a different species. It should work here. And so he flew out to Wisconsin. They tried it. It didn't work the first year, but the second year, 1979, they successfully raised sturgeon from eggs into hatchlings and fingerlings and yearlings, which was a really huge monumental success in sturgeon history because it had never been done before. So papers were written and people from all over the world were calling in like, how did you do this? What worked? But by doing this really opened the doors for sturgeon conservation in our state, because now they could raise sturgeon, and now all those lakes and rivers that were on that state of Wisconsin where sturgeon hadn't been located for 100 years, now they could start repopulating those with those sturgeon. And in fact, the sturgeon that we raise in Wisconsin, they go out to other states too, like Georgia and Tennessee and Missouri, states that haven't had sturgeon for over 100 years, and they're starting to repopulate lake sturgeon in those places too. All right, I have another group I need to talk about though. So remember how I said that the native people, the indigenous people of Wisconsin lived with sturgeon and depended on them so much for their culture, for their food, for their spiritual lives? Well, one group in particular is really tied to that, and that's the Menominee Nation. And they, throughout this whole thing, also had a stake in sturgeon conservation and a thread to this story as well. So the Menominee Nation in 1853 went from living in kind of that orange area of Wisconsin to getting relocated to a couple 100,000 acres of land on a reservation. Which they weren't glad to have that. That is not a good way of putting it, but they were more happy to have this than the other land that was offered to them because the Wolf River did run through their reservation. And they very specifically chose that land because the Wolf River had sturgeon, and it was really close to their homeland where they had lived for 10,000 years in the state that we now know as Wisconsin. And so they were still able to do their sturgeon festival and harvest sturgeon and all of that until, you guys might, if you look down on the bottom part of that, you might be able to guess what's going to happen here. In the late 1800s, a couple dams were built below their reservation on the river. And so then their sturgeon were not able to come up to them naturally. And in 1915, when they had that moratorium on sturgeon harvesting, they were not able to access sturgeon even elsewhere in the state. They couldn't go off reservation to do any of their ceremonies or anything like that. So they've been fighting a long time to get sturgeon back to the reservation. In the 1930s, Menominee leaders met with state leaders, and they started delivering sturgeon by truck up to the reservation. And in 1995, more recently, they've kind of restarted that process too. So here's a picture of that, where they're bringing the tanker truck in to bring in sturgeon, and they bring it right to the Kashina Falls there, and so that sturgeon can spawn there above the dams. The problem is that they know that about 50% of the sturgeon go back over the dam and then can't get back up again. So it's kind of like a yearly thing that they need to do. So in 1995, Menominee leaders met with state leaders and federal leaders too about this problem, about how they're having this not only a cultural disconnect with the sturgeon, but an ecological disconnect with the sturgeon. And so they came up with a plan to keep bringing spawning sturgeon up here, but they also started stocking. Now that they knew how to do that, they started stocking the lakes on the reservation so that they could grow their own too. So, and there's a sturgeon biologist on the reservation that also contributes to all the data that we collect for the sturgeon in the state. So those sturgeon are all tagged, and he is able to monitor all of those. So it's just some more data points that we're able to gather. So this is an ongoing story because they still, in 2005, they were granted the rights to build a fish passage around one of the dams, but it's very expensive and it hasn't happened yet. And then of course it's only one of the dams. So this is kind of like a to be continued. Like this is better than what they had, but it's not what they want. So that's kind of the third story of people coming together to get sturgeon back where they belong. And the fourth part, the last part, is really us right now. So in 2019, they created, the DNR set up a sturgeon management plan. It's a big PDF you could read online. And there's a couple different parts to it. So one part is just learning more about the life cycle. So Margaret Stadig, who is the sturgeon, well, she's the sturgeon general. Yes, she's one of the Wisconsin fish biologists who's in charge of that Lake Winnebago area. As she puts it, that like they've started acoustically tagging sturgeon, which is kind of like attaching like a GPS to the fish so they can see wherever they go instead of just when they scan them for those pit tag responders. But those only last 10 years, and we're getting to the end of the lifespan for that 10 years. And as she says, 10 years is nothing in a sturgeon's lifespan. That's a 10th of their life, you know? So if you think about a 10th of your life, like you've changed a lot in, you know, if 10% of your life goes by. So she's like, we need to keep learning more about the lifespan. But the other piece of that sturgeon plan is just outreach and engagement, and that's where you and I get involved. And this is how it kind of connects to what Joe was talking about too, is just learning more about them. And it doesn't have to be like, you know, holding up signs, save the sturgeon or anything like that. It could be like this group up here, the Lady Legends. That's a group of women who do hook and line fishing for sturgeon on Lake Holcomb up by where I live. And by engaging in them with fishing or engaging with them with spearing, it really helps you to know and care about the fish. That's what we've learned historically, right? Some of those fishers and spearers are the people who care the most about the fish. But there's other things you can do too if that's not for you. They still, every spring during the spawning, you can go see them spawn. It's pretty amazing. I got to do that a couple times. And they'll see scientists there. That's where they're also netting them and weighing and measuring and scanning those tags. The spearing registration's another place where they gather that data and you can go and watch. There's groups all over the state, like they're trying to repopulate sturgeon in so many different places in our state right now that probably there's a group near you that you could be involved in. Or at least, you know, maybe you could even start one. So, but really just want to end with like what Joe said, like the more you know about something, like that's how we get kids to care and people to care, which is one of the reasons why I wrote this as a kid's book too, because really sturgeon, when you think about their care, it's not managed in years, it's managed in decades and centuries. So we're needing like, you know, future generations to also know about these fish and to care about them so that they're here for our next generations of people. So with that, Anne, how do you do for time? And now I think we've got time for some questions,
Who
right?
knew fish?
Yeah.
Yeah, so we'd like to open it up to questions.
Here's the book.
Does anybody, John in the back or Sam will bring the microphone up. Is there anybody that start us off? Do you want to, I'll repeat your question if you want to say it.
I was curious, are sturgeon now in the rest of the state as well?
So-
Expanding, or is it still in that general area?
They are. They're.
So I'm going to say the question.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
So
go
our
ahead.
question was, what are the populations of lake sturgeon in other areas of the state besides Lake Winnebago?
Yeah, so they are in most of the major rivers now, Lake Chippewa River, by where in Eau Claire, where I live. I know my dad has caught a sturgeon there, but they're repopulating them. Like the Namacoggin River is a place where they've been stocking them. The St. Louis River, way up by like Duluth, Superior, that area. So they're there, but they're not there in the numbers that they once were. I think the estimate's like 1% of what it used to be.
Yeah.
And when they restock them, are they naturally actively repopulating there? Do they have to restock every year? I know what a lot of the DNR fisheries activities. I'm sorry, I've got a pretty loud voice anyway. But what I was asking was, when they restock them, does that population repopulate there, or are they having to keep restocking every year? Because I know DNR has to do that with a lot of places. I think.
Yeah, well, and I think the answer is it's a little too soon to know because it's 20 years. If you put a fingerling in the lake or river, it's 20 years before it's mature enough to spawn. So, like in Milwaukee, they've been stocking them on the Milwaukee River for 20 years now, and they're just getting to the age where they might see spawning, and they're really like excitedly watching to see if that's going to happen, but they don't know yet. So it's kind of a little bit of a leap of faith, and that's one thing that I think works against sturgeon conservation in Wisconsin is because you have to like put your faith in like 20 years down the line, and your money in 20 years down the line, like you're not going to see a whole lot right away.
You mentioned that they are using tags, acoustic tags, and I know that there is a concern in the oceans that the behavior of animals in the oceans is affected by noise. Have they looked to see if the acoustic tag is having any effect on the behavior of the fish, if that affected them in any negative manner?
Maybe both of you could answer that.
Yeah, do you know, Joe? Like, that's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that, so.
Yeah, I don't know the exact tags that they're using, but I think that they use frequencies that are beyond what would normally bother fish. But you're right that all of the noise pollution, for lack of a better term, of propellers and ships and all that kind of stuff, whether that's freshwater or saltwater, are having a pretty significant impact.
Yeah, good question. Anyone else?
Kind of related to the question, and it's hard not to feel, I guess, horrified reading the numbers. I know Joe and Becky, you both didn't want to push the conservation part too much, but I think reading, was it like 85 million sharks a year or something are slaughtered, or I probably don't have that number right. I think my question is, what are some of the ways that we can track these populations? Because if some stuff is unreported bycatch, like how is it actually that we arrive at these numbers? That's what I was curious about.
You're right that for example, sharks, which are commonly killed, not just for meat, but for the fin trade, a lot of that happens at the high seas, and it's illegal, unregulated, and unreported. And it also tends to overlap with other kinds of illegal trades. The same boats that ship some of that stuff around are also shipping weapons or drugs or human trafficking. That's a very difficult problem to crack. In some ways, if you can get some kind of reliable data and say, excuse me, that this population has declined by 10% in this data over this period of time, you may not know it declined from 10 million to 1 million or from 100 million to 10 million, but the slope or the change over time is still kind of similar. So people do the best that they can with the data that you get. I think in terms of fisheries, because it is so important as a food resource and countries are increasingly fighting over these resources, there's a lot more attention being paid to just by one country over another, like, hey, are the Panamanians taking Mexican fish? Are the Mexicans taking Panamanian fish? So there's increasing international pressure on everybody to report, but there still is all this unreported stuff that falls through the holes. I don't know how that applies to
Well, I think with lake sturgeon in Wisconsin, obviously it's a much smaller, number to deal with, so that makes it a little easier. But Wisconsin is kind of known as like the gold standard for managing sturgeon. It's not saying it's perfect and it's ideal and it's going to last forever, but by monitoring, like the numbers that they set for like sturgeon spearing, harvesting, and fishing are based directly on like numbers from the previous years and numbers, so it's like a whole mathematical algorithm that they use to do that. And so far that's really been working, using the science and the math to kind of encourage like it's kind of a self-fulfilling thing by fishing for that and getting the tag. It gives you the information to help you plan, you know, on the other side, if that makes sense.
Well, and I think something that we learned listening to Becky tell that story is that the lake sturgeon in Lake Winnebago are highly regulated. So the ability to gather that data and know exactly the numbers that they're considering shows you successful fishery. With the ocean, you know, that vast ocean, it becomes a requirement for these governments and these companies and this wonderful fisher that you talked about understanding, you know, the fisher is not going to have a business if they're overfished. And I think there's a big awareness. I think both books had that theme, but your question is very, very, we see it in other fish species in the Great Lakes. So thank you for that question. Other questions?
I'm just wondering what your perspectives are on aquaculture. I know specifically there are some sustainable ones with some of the bivalves that we're seeing, but in terms of consuming wild fish versus aquatically raised fish, what are your thoughts on the risks and benefits of that?
I did some nice interviews with people from NYU that studied this pretty closely, both from a how can you do it perspective, but also from a real nice perspective of the sort of welfare of the fishes that are involved. I think the short answer is that predatory fish that you have to feed fish to, it's probably a bad idea to do aquaculture. That's a very generalized statement, but you're basically just catching fish somewhere and feeding it. But more fishes that can be trained or that automatically eat vegetarian diets, like tilapia is the classic one, that's a pretty sustainable industry. And I will say this connects a little bit to what Becky was talking about. The fisher that I spoke to in Alaska, they really rely heavily on a hatchery system that raises fish in captivity to some designated size, and then they release them into the waters. And what she was talking about was that some years the fishers can tell that the natural population is doing really well and they're just more numerous, so they go fish that population. And some years when that natural reproduction is not doing well, then they go to areas that are more, you see the production from those hatcheries, and they fish those. And so they work kind of in tandem.
Yeah, I'm going to defer to you on that because I have not interviewed any aquaculture people for this particular book. So.
I saw the photo where they were harvesting the eggs for caviar, and it looked like they were just like throwing the rest of the fish away. Is it not good eating because it's old and a bottom feeder? Or what was
I
that?
think it depends who you ask whether or not I've never had it. Have you had it, Ann?
I had the caviar the
Okay.
first day I started at Wisconsin Sea Grant, and I thought, what job did I get? And it's very, very good. I've heard tell, so when there's only recreational fishing for lake sturgeon. So unless you go spearing, you'll never get to taste it. I understand from people in the know, such as Dr. Fish, who was out here before, is that they live a very long time, which means the fish becomes kind of fatty and it's a little meaty. But apparently the thing to do is to smoke it, and that is very delectable. But I don't think it's a fish that you have a fishery for necessarily for eating, like tilapia or salmon or whitefish or other species. So these are all the fish tales and the rumors I've heard. But yes, they're good, but not great.
So there's definitely a tradition behind eating it, but it never was, and I think that's why people didn't find it desirable too, because it wasn't like as good tasting as like walleye, or something like that. But the lady legends that I interviewed for this book, they've always thrown back. They've done that for 20 years. They've always thrown back the fish. They'd keep one so they could try it, and they said it tasted like ham. So there you go.
Yeah.
I was familiar with some of the issues in the lower Fox River over the years. I went to school at Lawrence, and when I was there in the late 60s, early 70s, there were basically two kinds of fish species in the lower Fox because the oxygen just wasn't there. In the 80s, I know that the oxygen had returned because of some of the pollution work, but they were looking at how to deal with the toxics, the PCBs, the heavy metals that were the residuals of all the factories there. And I was just curious, given the time span, whether sturgeon has returned to the lower Fox at all, and whether they were in Green Bay in that area at this point, or if you know by chance.
Did that come up in your research?
I am not, because there's still a lot of dams along that. I am not sure that they have necessarily, but I could be wrong, you know.
I wish Dr.
so-
Fish was here.
Yeah.
We're both librarians, so give me your name and I'll
Yeah,
find out for
exactly.
you.
We can find that answer and
Yeah.
get back to you. But I mean, just because I've been to that area a lot myself, like there's so many locks and dams along there that I would be surprised, and it really didn't come up in the research that they were there.
Yeah.
So that would be my best guess. Yeah. And I think too, like the toxicity you're talking about is also another reason too, like with fish that live a long time. Titus Seilheimer was telling us like there's a lot of contaminants built up in those fish too. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Oh. Oh, you guys probably know more than us then.
I think there's a question back here.
Yep. Oh,
Oh,
here.
no, so here.
One for Becky, one for Joe.
All right.
When we say Lake Sturgeon, is it also Lake Michigan, or is it entirely Lake Winnebago and the
So-
riverine system?
Yeah, so lake sturgeon's actually a species of sturgeon. So it's found in rivers, and it's found in all the Great Lakes and in many other rivers and lakes historically in the United States. So beyond just Lake Winnebago.
And then for Joe, how much of your book addresses or pertains to Caribbean reef fish or other and ocean fish?
I spent a couple of chapters on reef fishes just because it's so diverse. Half of all the freshwater, half the saltwater species are found on reefs, and so there's just one amazing story after another, octopus that punch other fishes and things like this. And so yeah, I spent a fair amount of time on coral reefs, both from the Caribbean and the Australian Great Barrier Reef. Throughout the book, I try to interview scientists that spent their whole lives working on it. So I talked to a really great scientist named Lexa Gruder, who studied cleaning stations, which is a really fun sort of barbershop salon thing that happens underwater where little bitty fish pick parasites off of bigger fish. She describes it as a very intimate relationship. And then also a woman named Karen Marusko, who looks into the acoustics of fish on reefs and how damselfish will sing to each other and display for territories. And so there's a lot of interesting stories in the coral reefs, and it's a place that I think a lot of people can have an opportunity to spend time, unlike the deep sea. So I do cover it for quite a bit.
That was my favorite part of the book. I have to say,
Agree.
I learned a lot there. We probably have time for one more question. I think you were going to ask something.
Oh, she thinks she's got it back here.
And then we'll
Yeah.
get you.
With the restocking of the sturgeon, and being that they are so long-lived, are they currently monitoring the health of the individual fishes, not just the population, saying, okay, we have so many, but what the state of the health of the actual fish is? Is that being monitored at all as part of the reintroduction into the rivers and lakes?
It is, and as I said, they net sturgeon like during the spawning season, and that's part of what they're looking for is the health of the fish. And there are some concerns because sturgeon, like every other species, are sensitive to temperature changes and climate changes. Not so much the big ones, but the little ones are, and that can affect all sorts of things. Like in Milwaukee in 2023, I think it was, all the hatchlings died. Like 80% of them died, and they did not survive. And they think what happened is that it was a really warm spring, and so there was a pathogen that they were exposed to that they weren't big enough to like deal with, that they usually face a little bit later on. So that is something they're very much trying to study and maintain and stay ahead of, but it's it's tough.
One more question before we wrap up.
So I know you talked a lot about like the benefits for saving the sturgeon for humans. So like, what sort of ecological niche do sturgeons fill? Like, how does the ecosystem suffer without them? And have we seen any improvements in the ecosystem now that we're reintroducing them, or is it still too early to really tell that either?
Well, I think sturgeon are a really good indicator species, so they like kind of let you know like the water quality and just the health in general of your the water environment. So if they're located there, it usually means that other species are doing really well too. So that's probably like the main one. When I talked to Margaret Stadig, that she said that that's the main thing. Like if we can sustain these, it also helps all these other fish. They, of course, by cleaning up the bottoms of our lakes, contribute to that so that there's not as much growth and stuff on the bottom of the lakes and that kind of thing. But mostly it's just an indicator that it's a healthy body of water to have those fish in there, because that's where they've lived for 150 million years.
All right, well, we have to wrap up. I want to thank you all for your wonderful questions, and I really want to thank our authors for coming today and talking about these fish species. They will both be outside for about 30 minutes at a table if you'd like to purchase a book and have it signed, but also they're there for brief conversation, a little fishtail sharing if you'd like to do that. So let's give our speakers a round of applause.